Dig Dug, the classic arcade game where you pump air into cute little critters with your bicycle pump to blow them up or dump rocks on top of their heads. Yeah, that game. This is the Atari 7800 version of Dig Dug, and it's not necessarily a game that I'm particularly in love with. Not that I dislike it, but it's certainly a game that I won't be anxious to get back to very often. I'm personally much happier with Joust, thanks. But still, it's a pretty good game. Can be fun at times, and it's a Namco arcade classic that eventually got the same treatment as every other arcade classic back in the day. The obligatory home conversion to every single video game system available and in production back in the 1980s. Strangely enough though, Dig Dug did not get a localized release on the Nintendo Entertainment System. You needed to move to Japan and buy a Famicom for that wonderful iteration. But we did get Dig Dug 2 for the NES, which makes sense, I guess. No it doesn't. Doggy doesn't think it makes sense, so it doesn't. Let's move on. So if you're familiar with Dig Dug and the way it works, you know, you gotta move around the soil and kill all the enemies by pumping air into them or dropping rocks on them, you'll encounter no surprises in this 7800 version. Gameplay for the most part remains unaltered from the arcade original. You still have the air pumping action, the rock crushing action, the little jingle that plays when you're moving about. Pretty much as close as you can get with this version, but it's fairly true to form. Control's rather good, it's fairly responsive, there's no lag to hinder your progress, it works. Probably the best compliment you could give a game's control for the most part, that's all that really needs to be said. It works. Let's move on. That sort of thing. Like most 7800 games, you have the obligatory level of difficulty select, so anybody can jump into this without much trouble. Not a big deal or anything like that. Now, it's a fair version of Dig Dug gameplay-wise. Visually speaking, Dig Dug got a pretty fair transition to the Atari 7800. It's bright and colorful, it matches the arcade original's levels and graphics fairly well, and everything's instantly recognizable and familiar. Just about the only real negative is that the graphics are somewhat rough looking, almost pixelated to a point, but that's not a huge detriment or anything, it still looks good for the most part. Now an interesting bit of trivia here regarding the sound. If you played the Atari 2600 version of Dig Dug, then you'll no doubt recognize some of the sound effects used in this 7800 version of the same game. In fact, if you were to play both versions with your eyes closed and your ears opened, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference because they sound almost exactly the same thing. Possibly the 7800 version might have some differences here and there, but for the most part the two versions both sound the same way. I don't know whether I'm supposed to be thrilled or disappointed, but honestly it doesn't really matter. Sounds alright for the most part, resembles the arcade sounds and jingles to a point, so there's not much to complain about as there. I just thought it'd be an interesting bit of trivia. Still, sound quality is not a detriment to the overall enjoyment of the game, and Dig Dug's still a solid port overall on the Atari 7800. It's a pretty cheap buy these days, so it may very well be worth a look. Not bad at all.